Hi, everyone. I'm Rich Kravitz. I'm the director of UC Center Sacramento. It's a pleasure to welcome you here today. We're very pleased to be featuring Professor Noli from UC Davis. This talk is supported in part through the generous sponsorship of the Center for California Real Estate, to whom we're very grateful. And we do look forward very much to Professor Brazil's presentation. A couple announcements with respect to next week. On Wednesday, during our regular speaker series, we'll be having a feature presentation by Professor Dan Bruckner on mortgage default. He's from UC Irvine. And the day before, in the afternoon, we have one of our quarterly Capital Insights panels on implications of marijuana legalization for California. So we'll be having some very interesting speakers and moderated. The whole event will be moderated by Karen Smith, who's the director of the California Department of Public Health. So with that, a brief introduction of today's speaker. Professor Brazil is an assistant professor in the Department of Community and Regional Development at UC Davis. He's has both undergraduate and doctoral degrees from the University of California, Berkeley. He did postdoctoral work at University of Southern California, as well as Yale. And his work, as we'll see, focuses on the interrelationship of people and places, spatial demography. So, Professor Brazil, we're very glad to have you here, and we look forward to your talk on the geographic distribution of place-based economic development programs in California cities. Professor Brazil.
Okay, great. So thank you everybody for attending my talk today, and thank you for the invitation to present. So as Richard sort of presented already, in this presentation I'm planning to present results from an examination of the geographic placement, the spatial layout of what are known as place-based economic development programs here in California, with a particular focus on the relationship between the geographic placement of these programs and housing affordability, an issue that is very much pressing and oftentimes depressing for Californians. Okay, so in order to provide some context and perhaps a little motivation for the topic I'm presenting today, let me sort of take you all back to December 2017, when President Trump and his administration they announced the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which provided some amendments to the Internal Revenue Code of 1986. And the primary focus and attention of the act is on a set of sweeping tax cuts, tax relief for individuals, households, corporate entities. But within this act was the creation of the Opportunity Zone program. So the Opportunity Zone program is an example of a place-based economic development program whereby certain communities, certain neighborhoods, they receive financial investment, financial capital investment for projects to help spur economic development in that distressed area. So individuals, corporate entities, financial institutions, they provide this financial investment to help spur economic development, and so in return they receive some sort of financial tax relief on their capital gains. So the concept behind the Opportunity Zone program is not new. So place-based economic development programs have been around for quite some time here in the United States and also internationally in the UK, Asian countries. So here's just a small handful of the place-based programs that are active here in the US. So for example, enterprise zones have been around for quite some time, since the early 90s, mid-90s. And here, the focus with the Enterprise Zone program is on job job creation, economic development through job creation in combination with business development, business attraction, business retention, and expansion. So these place-based economic development programs, not all of them entirely focus just on affordable housing, but oftentimes community-based organizations, economic development agencies rely on these place-based programs for funding specifically affordable housing projects. So our Governor, Gavin Newsom, he had a speech a month or so ago, released his governor's budget, and affordable housing is clearly a big sort of topic, big agenda item. And so in particular, the governor's budget called for the quintupling of funding for the low-income housing tax credit program, which is a type of place-based economic development program, right? And just more funding in general towards affordable housing projects, relying on place-based programs like the Opportunity Zones, like the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program. So it's very clear that housing affordability is going to be funded, and it looks like these place-based programs are going to be a key driver for developing these affordable housing projects that the governor is trying to establish. So in policy and in practice and in academic research, the primary attention is on examining the effects, the impacts of these place-based programs on the neighborhoods that they serve. However, I'm going to take a step back, and rather than looking at the consequences of these programs, I'm more interested in understanding the types of neighborhoods, the characteristics of the neighborhoods that are actually eligible in the first place. So rather than the downstream effects, I'm more interested in which neighborhoods are actually qualified or eligible for these different place-based programs. In particular, I examine characteristics related to housing affordability in that neighborhood, a metric that's often not incorporated in eligibility criteria. I also look at change over time. So it's one thing to be a disadvantaged community right now. It's another thing to be a disadvantaged community that has experienced some kind of improvement over time through some kind of renewal process, like, for example, gentrification. I also look at overlap and contiguity. So in that prior slide, I just showed just a small handful of the place-based programs that are in existence in the US, in California. There's a lot more. And so that raises a question for me, are these place-based programs being bundled? Are they concentrated in certain types of neighborhoods? In the case of contiguity, if you're a neighborhood that's qualified or eligible for a program, does that also mean that nearby neighborhoods that are adjacent to your neighborhood, are they also qualified or eligible for those programs? So that brings up implications regarding spillover effects. So I don't entirely ignore the examination of the effects or the impacts of these programs on neighborhoods. Towards the end of this presentation, I'll provide some preliminary results examining the impact of a couple of these programs, specifically on housing affordability metrics. But before I sort of dive into the empirical results, let me provide just a little bit more context and definition as to what I mean by a place-based economic development program. And so in order to do this, let me first contrast and compare it to sort of another traditional approach to economic development, person-based programs. So in person-based programs, rather than targeting a community, rather than targeting a neighborhood, you're providing financial assistance to specific individuals or specific households. Right? So an individual or a household, they apply for some sort of person-based program. If they meet some kind of income criteria, income threshold, they are qualified or eligible to receive financial assistance towards some sort of cost. And this is regardless of where that household or that individual lives. Right? So they could be living in a low-income area, a middle-income area, a high-income area. It doesn't matter. The key criteria is what is your household's income, what is your individual's income. So, sort of example of a person-based program is the SNAP program, right? Formerly known as the food stamp program. And in this program, families, they apply for financial assistance to receive sort of assistance relief, financial relief towards groceries and produce. So individuals, they're qualified to receive this financial assistance as long as they meet some sort of income criteria or income threshold. In contrast to person-based programs, there's place-based programs. So place-based programs, rather than individual 1, individual 2, household 1, household 2, financial investment or assistance is targeted towards a geographic area, a geographic zone, a neighborhood, a community. So the idea behind a place-based program is rather than supporting or helping a handful of residents in perhaps a disadvantaged community, with the risk that those residents, once they move up the economic ladder, they might leave the area, right, leaving that community behind. The idea behind a place-based program is to infuse that specific geographic area with financial investment, with the hopes that it'll lift residents, all residents in that community. Right? So it's targeting a specific geographic zone versus a person-based program targeting a specific individual, a specific household. So in the case of affordable housing, a person-based program would be something like Section 8, the Section 8 housing voucher program. So here, households, individuals, they apply to this program. If they meet certain income criteria, thresholds, they receive financial relief, housing voucher, financial relief towards monthly payments that go towards housing rental costs. In contrast, you have the New Market Tax Credit program. This is a place-based program whereby financial investments are targeted towards projects that are then placed in certain neighborhoods based on socioeconomic criteria. Right? So the difference, once again, financial assistance directed towards an individual versus financial investment directed towards projects placed in a geographic zone. So what do I mean by a geographic area? What do I mean by community? What do I mean by neighborhood? In practical terms, I'm basically talking about census tracts. So census tracts, these are administrative boundaries created by the U.S. Census Bureau. They're meant to capture sort of the local definition of a neighborhood, local definition of place and space. Right? They're roughly between 2,000 to 8,000, contain roughly about 2,000 to 8,000 residents. They're sort of geographically bounded spaces. And these census tracts, they become eligible based on some set of criteria, typically based on the poverty rate in that census tract or median household income. If income is used, these programs typically try to control for regional differences in cost of living. For example, you don't want to compare a neighborhood or a census tract in the Central Valley to a census tract, say, in the Bay Area because of large discrepancies in cost of living. And there are other sort of selection mechanisms that go beyond just looking at economic or socioeconomic characteristics, typically taking into account state, local jurisdiction input, community-based input. And the main sort of financial tools that are used in these place-based programs are typically financial grants or some form of tax credit. And they're awarded to public sector agencies like the Economic Development Department in a city government, community-based organizations like Community Development Corporations, CDCs, or community development entities sort of broadly defined. Right? So they take these grants, they take these tax credits to help fund specific projects in a local census tract, in a local area. And when I'm talking about affordable housing, when I say specific projects, for the most part, I'm talking about building or rehabilitating affordable housing units in that area. So in this presentation and in my analyses, I focus on 6 particular place-based programs. opportunity zones, which I described just a little bit earlier, New Market Tax Credit Program, Low Income Housing Tax Credit Program, the CDFI, the Community Development Financial Institutions Fund Investment Areas Program, and their Areas of Economic Distress Program. So these first 5 programs, nationwide census tracts are eligible for these programs. The 6th one is the SB 535 Disadvantaged Communities Program. So that's only specific to census tracts in California. So because of time limitations, I'm not going to go through each of these programs in super detail, but in the next couple of slides, let me just provide just a little bit more context and definition, just so that we're sort of familiar as to what these programs are actually doing. In particular, providing sort of the criteria for census tract eligibility, because that's sort of one of my key main points in this presentation. So let me first start out with the New Market Tax Credits Program. So I'm going to show you basically the pathway or the pipeline from funding source all the way down to project being invested in a local community. So a state or local government jurisdiction, they provide tax credits to community development entities. So I described a little bit about what these community development entities are. They could be traditional nonprofits like a CDC. They could be a for-profit financial institution like a traditional bank. They could be a for-profit non-financial institution like a developer, private corporation. So they receive these tax credits, then they sell these tax credits to investors. So anyone can be an investor for a lot of these programs. You all could invest. You all could receive a tax credit and be an investor in a program. But typically we're talking about corporate entities, banks, for-profit banks, companies. They receive these tax credits, and in return, they provide financial capital back to the CDE, the Community Development Entity, who then uses that financial capital to fund projects in particular census tracts. In the case of the New Market Tax Credits Program, a census tract must have a median family income at or below 80% of the area-wide income, or its poverty rate must be 20% or greater. So this is sort of the basic pipeline for I won't say a typical, but at least a tax credit-specific place-based economic development program. Funding source all the way down to project being invested in a specific census tract. So here is a specific project, an affordable housing project that was funded by the New Market Tax Credits Program. This is a mixed-use development project in a distressed census tract in Imperial, California, combining commercial properties along with affordable housing units. So I talked very briefly about opportunity zones, but how are census tracts actually designated as an opportunity zone? Like how does a neighborhood become an opportunity zone? There's sort of a multi-pronged process that's involved. First, at the federal level, they whittle down the census tracts to those that are considered to be low income. And low income census tracts take on the same criteria as the New Market Tax Credit Program I described earlier. So in California, based on this criteria, there are about 3,500 census tracts that are considered to be low income. And that's out of a total of around 8,000 census tracts. Then the federal government provides a lot of leeway for each state to then select up to 25% of those census tracts to be then designated as an opportunity zone. So in the case of California, there are now 879 census tracts that are defined or designated as opportunity zones. Now, there's a lot of variation in terms of how states select this 25%. Some states use just straight, cut and dry socioeconomic characteristics, but a lot of them take into account local recommendations, city government, local jurisdictions, community-based organizations can recommend to the governor's administration, this tract should be an opportunity zone, this tract shouldn't be an opportunity zone. There's also the consideration of overlap with existing programs to try to bundle up opportunity zones with other place-based programs. And also there's a consideration of tracts that are contiguous or adjacent to other census tracts who are low income. So you have a tract that's not low income, but it's right next to a low income tract. Oftentimes they'll be sort of put back into the pool as being eligible for opportunity zone funding. So that's opportunity zones. Let me talk about quickly the low income housing tax credit program. So the low income housing tax credit program, this is actually not a purely place-based economic development program. It's actually a combination of person and place-based. So the person-based sort of kicks in, whereby developers, they receive tax credits for building affordable housing, specifically for households that meet certain income criteria. Right, so that's a person-based sort of criteria, person-based approach. The place-based kicks in, whereby developers can receive a 30% bump in their tax credits if that project, that affordable housing project, is situated in a certain census tract. A certain census tract has to be defined as residing in a difficult to develop area, so it has high construction, land, and utility costs, or it's considered to be a qualified census tract based on meeting household income and poverty rate requirements. Okay, so what about the California-specific program, SB 535? So this is a program that's based off the cap-and-trade program here in California. So the funding, the money from the cap-and-trade program gets deposited into what's known as the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. Right? So this fund helps support projects to help reduce greenhouse gas emissions in California. So 25% of that fund has to be allocated or channeled towards projects that help benefit individuals and communities that are considered to be disadvantaged. 75%, it could be in other disadvantaged, or non-disadvantaged or disadvantaged areas. The key thing is that 25% of this funding has to be in disadvantaged areas. So then the question is, what is a disadvantaged community under this SB 535 program? So unlike the other programs, this program is multidimensional. So it captures population characteristics, health characteristics, things like educational attainment, things like unemployment. And because this is coming from the Greenhouse Gas Fund, the Cap-and-Trade program, it factors in measures of pollution burden, proximity to hazardous sites, pesticide use, the quality of drinking water. So what they do is they combine these 20 plus characteristics into a single index called the Cal EnviroScreen score. So if your census tract, if a census tract meets some kind of threshold on this index, it's at or above this index threshold, it's deemed as a disadvantaged community and hence is eligible for funding under this program. So hopefully what I'm conveying to you all today by describing these different programs is that eligibility criteria for these different programs are not standardized, right? It's not a simple cut and dry, the census tract has to meet percent poverty of 20%, or it has to have a median household income of X dollars, right? There's a lot of variation. So in this case here, SB 535, we're combining 20-odd characteristics, putting it all together. In the case of the new market tax credits, it's just simple household income poverty rate. In the case of the opportunity zone, it's a combination of socioeconomic characteristics, then a bunch of wiggle room and ambiguity of local jurisdictions, communities saying, oh, we should have this track, be an opportunity zone. So it's not standardized across the board. And so I'm curious, I'm questioning, okay, so what are we actually capturing here? Like what kinds of neighborhoods, because of this sort of non-standardized approach, what are we actually capturing here? What types of disadvantage are we capturing with these different eligibility criteria? So that's sort of the impetus or the motivation for my research on this topic I'm presenting on today. Okay, so let me show you there's a lot of words, now I want to show you a lot of numbers. So it's like 2 stages in my presentation. So here is at least a portion of the table. This is showing the percent of census tracts in metropolitan areas in California. So keep that in mind, this is census tracts in metro areas. by program eligibility in the year 2018. So OZ stands for Opportunity Zone, NMTC is New Market Tax Credit, LIHTC is a Low Income Housing Tax Credit Program, IA, AED, these are the CDFI funding programs, investment areas of economic distress, and the SB 535, that's the cap and trade program. So here you see quite a bit of variation in terms of the percent of metro area tracts in California that are eligible for these different programs. Right? At the lower end, you have roughly about 11% of census tracts in California, metro area census tracts, are eligible or are designated as opportunity zones. At the higher end, you have almost half, 49%, are designated or eligible for funding for the investment areas program. So not only do you see variation sort of across programs, you also see variation across geography. So a lot of data here, but basically what this is showing is, once again, percent of census tracts that are eligible by these different programs for certain cities paired based on sort of regionality or sort of geographic proximity. Right? So you got Sacramento, Stockton, you got San Francisco, Oakland, representing the Bay Area, Bakersfield, Fresno, sort of Central Valley, and then finally San Diego and Los Angeles down in Southern California. And so you still see variation across programs, but more importantly, you see sort of dramatic differences between cities that are sort of coupled together geographically. So, for example, in San Diego and Los Angeles, down in Southern California, we find that the percent of tracts that are eligible for Opportunity Zone funding there's a difference, but it's not super huge, right? 20% in LA, 14% in San Diego. But then you look at the SB 535 program, all the way to the right, in the rightmost column, you see that more than half of LA's census tracts are eligible for funding under this program, whereas in San Diego, it's only 10%. And you see other sort of major differences between these different cities, once again, paired together based on proximity to one another. Okay, so more numbers, more tables. So I'm interested in looking at what these neighborhoods look like, what these census tracts look like based on their eligibility criteria. So here I show demographic characteristics, so percent racial, ethnic composition, as well as percent foreign-born, percent immigrant population. It's showing the census tracts that are eligible for each of these 6 programs, and for census tracts that are eligible for none of these programs. So that's this top line up here. And so you see that there's quite a big difference, right, between census tracts that are eligible for any of these programs versus census tracts that are eligible for none. It's significantly less white, significantly more Hispanic, less Asian, more Black, and a larger proportion of the residents are foreign-born. Okay, so that's demographic characteristics. What about economic characteristics? So here I show median income, percent poverty, percent unemployment, percent college attainment. What do neighborhoods look like that are eligible for each of these programs relative to census tracts that have none? Once again, there's a fairly clear picture. They're more disadvantaged economically, much lower median income, much higher percent poverty, much higher unemployment rate, much lower college attainment rates. Okay, so let's focus on sort of the main topic of today's presentation, or the main topic or theme of this seminar, housing characteristics. Right? Do we see clear disadvantages for housing characteristics? Here I show median housing value, median gross rent, and measures of cost burden. So cost burden represents the percent of households who are paying 30% or more of their income towards housing or rental costs. Sort of a standard definition of burden, both in economics and policy and in practice. So what do we see here? We see sort of a similar story, right? Census tracts that are eligible for one of these 6 programs, much lower housing values, much lower rent, much higher renter cost burden. But one thing I want to point out, we do see that these census tracts that are eligible for these programs, we see a slightly increased housing cost burden but you'll notice that the difference is not as large relative to census tracts that have no eligibility. So if the census tract is not eligible for any of these 6 programs, approximately 25% of the residents or the households are considered to be cost burden, housing cost burden. Compare that to census tracts that are eligible for any of these 6 programs, it's roughly between 28 to 29%. So still disadvantaged, but not, it's a lot more muted, especially when you compare it to the renter cost burden difference. So looking at these current characteristics, it does appear that these programs are capturing disadvantaged neighborhoods across demography, across economics, even across housing characteristics. But this housing cost burden variable seems to be a little bit more muted. Keep that in mind, because that's going to be a theme in the rest of this presentation.
Would you explain the difference between housing cost burden and renter cost burden?
Yeah, I'm sorry. So housing would be if you own a home. Rental is, you're renting a home. So we looked at current characteristics. What about change over time? Right? It's one thing to be disadvantaged now. It's another thing to be disadvantaged in the past 10 or 15 years. It's another thing to be disadvantaged, but you're seeing improvements over time. And so here I show a similar layout, but this time change in median income and change in percent poverty since 2000. So 2000 up to 2016, so about a 15, 16-year window. So we see very similar to what we saw with the current characteristics, that census tracts that are eligible for these 6 programs appear to be more disadvantaged or experiencing declines in median income, whereas census tracts that have no eligibility, right, we see an increase. Similar story for percent poverty, increases in poverty, but no increase or a slight decrease for none. Yes?
Are those adjusted dollars
Those are adjusted
to current day or?
current day, or 2016. Okay, so what about renter characteristics, right? What about, in particular, cost burden? So focus more on the cost burden characteristic, because that takes into account not only just how much a household is paying, but how much a household is paying relative to how much they're earning. Right? So the gross rent and the housing values may not tell you the whole story. So here we find that since 2000, census tracts that have been eligible for none, or are not eligible for any of these programs, have experienced a 6 percentage point increase in renter cost burden. But then if you look at census tracts that are eligible for any of these 6 programs, the increase is almost double for all of these programs. Now, what about homeowners? So once again, don't focus too much on the median housing value, because it doesn't take into account a person's income. Focus more on the cost burden characteristics. So here we find a starkly different story, right? So here, a census tract that's not eligible for any of these programs, once again, this top row, since 2000 has experienced a slight decrease, a negative 2 percentage point decrease in cost burden for homeowners. If you look at census tracts that are eligible for any of these 6 programs, the decrease is minimal, similar, and you see a slight increase for one of these programs, right? So compare that to, once again, renter cost burden, right? Pretty clear contrast, pretty clear difference. Whereas for the housing cost burden, there's very little difference. It's a question in the back.
Have you calculated what percentage of these populations are renters versus homeowners?
I did not. No. And your point for?
I would presume that you have a very small percentage of those who are able to achieve home ownership. And I'd be curious as to see if those who are able to achieve home ownership have also declined over time.
No, that's a good point. Maybe a home ownership rate would be an important characteristic there.
Thank you.
with that sort of in mind, nonetheless, we see that census tracts that have no eligibility are pretty much similar to census tracts that have eligibility in one of these programs for this housing cost burden variable. So we've gone through current characteristics, over time. Now I want to talk a little bit about overlap. So what do I mean by overlap? I mean are programs being bundled in the same tracts? So here I show the percent of census tracts by the number of place-based programs that are eligible in that census tract. So in 2018, 42% of census tracts had 0 or no programs, place-based programs eligible in those census tracts. About 11% had just 1 of these programs eligible. About 9% just 2. And you see a relatively even distribution until you reach 6. So in this case here, there are about 6% of census tracts in 2018 that were eligible for all 6 programs. Met the criteria for all 6 programs, whatever that criteria may be. So overall, the mean number of programs in a tract in 2018 was 1.92. But that number is kind of maybe not exactly capturing the right portrait here because, as you can see, the distribution is quite skewed. Right? Almost half of census tracts have 0. So maybe a median value is better. So the median number of programs in the tract in California, in metro areas, is 1. You see some variation by program. So we find that at the top, it seems like opportunity zones are doing a better job, if you want to call it that way, a better job of bundling programs together. So what does that 4.3 number mean? It means that if you're a census tract that's eligible for opportunity zone funding, that means that on average you have 4.3 programs eligible. 4.3 other programs eligible. So if you're an opportunity zone, you have 4 other sources of funding available to you. So time is limiting here, so let me try to quickly go through these next couple of slides. What do these neighborhoods or census tracts look like when you look at change over time? Right? Census tracts that have 0, 1, 2, up through 6 programs eligible. What do they look like in terms of change in income and change in poverty? We see a bit of a threshold effect happening here. Right? You see that the census tract has 0 or 1 program eligible. You see an increase in income since 2000 and a slight decrease, if no change in poverty. But once you jump to 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, you see a clear difference, right? A decrease in income since 2000 and an increase in poverty. We see a similar portrait when we're looking at cost, renter cost burden. 0 and 1, slight increase in renter cost burden. 2 up through 6, larger increases in renter cost burden. There seems to be some sort of threshold or tipping point effect. Homeownership burden. We do see a threshold effect, but it's much higher. So if you're a census tract that has 0 up through 3, housing cost burden either decreased or had very little change. Once you get up to the 4, 5s, and 6s, you see that housing cost burden has actually increased since 2000. Okay, so what about contiguity? So are neighborhoods that are eligible for a program, are they next to other neighborhoods that are also eligible? So this is for the city of Los Angeles, this is for the Opportunity Zones program. Red indicates eligibility. And so we do see some elements of clustering, right? Neighborhoods that are red are typically around neighborhoods that are red. Compare that to the SB 535 program, where there are clear sort of regimes of eligibility in the city of Los Angeles. And this may not be surprising, number one, because there are more tracts that are eligible for this program, but also number two, remember SB 535 takes into account pollution burden characteristics, which are often geographically clustered and concentrated. For the sake of time, unfortunately, I'll have to pass through these next two nice maps, but this is a wonderful city of Sacramento. But I want to get through the impacts of effects. So I promised you guys to show you some results looking at the impact of these programs on the neighborhoods. So I look at if a program was eligible in 2010, what kind of change do we see in median income, homeowner cost burden, and renter cost burden from 2010 to 2016. So I ran some multivariate analyses to get these results. And I find that if you're a census tract that's eligible for one of these three programs, so I don't show the other three because I don't have data that goes back far enough. So Opportunity Zones, as I described earlier, is a new program. SB 535 is a new program. I only have longitudinal results for these three programs. So if you're a census tract that's eligible for one of these three programs, you find a bump, a slight percentage increase in median income, a slight decrease in renter cost burden, but no change in homeowner cost burden. So no change in homeowner cost burden. Okay, so I'm going to pass that. So I've shown sort of a lot of information to everyone here, a lot of data, a lot of results. Let me try to summarize sort of what I found and maybe provide some basic policy suggestions or implications. So once again, my curiosity, my interest was I observed that eligibility criteria for these different programs are not standardized across the board. So what kind of neighborhoods are we actually capturing? And so it appears like a lot of these programs are capturing disadvantaged neighborhoods when you're looking at current characteristics with homeownership burden, that difference being sort of muted. When you look at change over time, taking into account where these census tracts are coming from, the evolution of these census tracts, I find that we do see that more disadvantaged tracts are being captured, but we see no real differences with homeowner burden. And so my recommendation or what my results are sort of showing is that place-based economic development programs, they're part of the landscape of economic development. And with Gavin Newsom, with the governor, sort of putting forward in his agenda that affordable housing, a large proportion of affordable housing projects will likely be funded through a lot of these place-based programs. You need to be careful about the types of neighborhoods that are actually receiving funding for these programs. Right? In particular, for programs that are specifically focused on affordable housing, we should incorporate specific measures, explicit measures of homeowner cost burden, as well as measures of change over time. Right? Where are these neighborhoods coming from? Are they improving? Are they decreasing? What are they gentrifying? Capturing current change over time characteristics and explicitly incorporating home ownership burden in that eligibility criteria is important, particularly for projects that are geared towards affordable housing. So I think I ran out of time, so I guess time for a Q&A.